Welcome. My name is Cliff Freilich. I'm Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis. We're going to be having a conversation momentarily with Director Alex Winter. Before that, I want to remind you, of course, that in case you're seeing this outside of the context of having ordered the film, because it will be available elsewhere, the film's going to be available virtually on November 21 and 22 as part of the St. Louis International Film Festival. So that's the basics. Let me introduce the person who's going to be interviewing Alex and Alex himself. The person who's doing the interview is Daniel Durchholz, who's actually an old colleague of mine from the Riverfront Times from many, many years back. He has lots of credits. He's the author of Rock and Roll Myths, the true stories behind the most infamous legends. Neil Young, Long May You Run, The Illustrated History, and Music Hound Rock, The Essential Album Guide. And he's a former editor at both Replay and Request magazines, STLtoday.com, and the Riverfront Times. You've probably seen a lot of his work on the Post-Dispatch website. Alex Winter, I suspect you don't need an introduction to. Alex is, of course, first came to the forefront as an actor, and you've just seen him again as an actor, returned to his role as Bill in Bill and Ted's Face the Music. And then he transitioned to first doing feature films as a director. And more recently, he's done a string of really high quality documentaries, beginning with Download It. And he's got a couple out right now. Zappa is the one we're discussing, but he's got another film that's recently available too. I'm going to now turn things over to Dan Durchholz and Alex Winter.
Hi, Alex. Welcome, and welcome back to your hometown, if only virtually.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, it's good to not be here, be here.
2020, it's just been a crazy year in so many ways, but for you, it's been one of those years where several projects have come to fruition all at once. Of course, there's the new Bill and Ted movie, Bill and Ted Face the Music, your HBO documentary, which is really terrific, Showbiz Kids, which everybody really needs to check out on HBO, and Zappa, the documentary that we're here to talk about. What has this year been like for you with all these things happening at once?
I mean, it's surreal. I mean, it's compartmental. There's the "this just sucks for everybody" compartment, right? We're all in this pandemic together. It's it's a catastrophe, and everyone's trying to get through it. And that's really been very prominent for me this year. It's also, as you said, it's the culmination of decades of work in other areas, which has been quite surreal. With Bill and Ted, which we've been working on for over 10 years, we did have the opportunity to just hit pause and say, we'll just stick it on a shelf and come back when COVID is over. But it took us so long to get the film made, and it was really a fan service movie, and we made it for the fans and because of the fans. It felt really unfair to wait another 2 years, which is probably what it would have been. So we just went full steam ahead, and I'm very glad we did, actually. Showbiz Kids was the easiest because it was on HBO, and it was never going to do a theatrical run, and they were great, and it was a very easy and light rollout for us. It was stress-free. Zappa has been nothing but, just like Frank himself, been nothing but trouble from day one. It's been, I would say the most gratifying thing I've done in the doc space. It's also by far the hardest. I've been on this thing for years, and there were many permutations to how we got here. We were about to do this big splashy festival premiere, world premiere at South by Southwest, and COVID hit just days before our premiere, and everything, our worldwide rollout, everything stopped. And we had to regroup and figure out what we were going to do. And thankfully, we found Magnolia, and they found us, and they loved the movie. And once we had them in place, we were able to go back and do some of the festivals like you guys, which is really great. And we're super happy that people are getting to see it this way. But it was very stressful and quite complicated to figure out the rollout.
Yeah. People were familiar with you from a young age as an actor, but you've done a lot of work behind the camera as well that people might not be as aware of. What has your journey been like on the way to that side of your career, to directing? I know you did some TV and some other films, and I think even some music videos maybe. What has that journey been like for you?
Well, so I mean, I've been at it for 30 years, so I'll give you a short answer, which is that I was always doing both. I started acting and directing at WashU, right? My mom taught dance there, and I was this little kid always on campus. And when the drama department needed a child for a play, they threw me on stage. And if the film department was showing whatever it was at Brown Hall at the time, for the locals, I would go. And WashU was my babysitter, and it was also my education. And I grew up with a passion for filmmaking equal to a passion for acting from a very, very young age, and started making movies back at home in St. Louis. And then I was acting on Broadway through my teens, but my sights were always set on film school. They were always set on getting an education in filmmaking. And so I went to NYU off of that money, and then I came out and I was directing music videos and commercials professionally right out of college before I was even acting in the film. So, I mean, to your point, it's a more anonymous vocation. So I've been doing it as long as the acting is just not as public. But I was directing music videos and commercials nonstop from the mid '80s. And I started making docs. My first doc was Downloaded, which we showed at the Tivoli, and about Napster, and I made that about a little less than 10 years ago, and I've been making docs ever since, essentially.
Yeah. Well, moving on to the Zappa film, Frank passed away in 1993 at the age of 52, which is mind-blowing to think about when you consider how much material he put out and how much has come out since his death. But why did you think his was a story that needed to be told?
Kind of a multi-pronged answer, I think. I mean, making a movie about someone like Zappa, even having the desire to make a movie about someone like Zappa, not even knowing if you're going to get to make it, requires there to be a bunch of things that are going to drive you, because you just know that is hard to get made. And hard to make. And my producer Glenn Zipper and I were looking at projects. I'd come off a film called Deep Web, which was very fascinating, but actually quite depressing. It was also at this festival, and it involved a federal criminal trial and some very dark things. And I was looking for something that had a bit more levity, but I also wanted something that tackled American cultural history and from a personal standpoint and in a broad way. And so we started looking at people who fit that bill, and we eventually were wondering to ourselves, why has no one ever told the Frank Zappa story? It's just sitting there. And, here was a guy who was a cultural icon, a musical icon, lived across this extraordinary span of American history, fought politically, was engaged politically, was at the forefront of the sexual revolution, at the forefront of voting rights movement, all of these things. Nothing. All we've had about Frank were these kind of cutesy, quirky things about him making, funny comments to the press, or, I think quite rewardingly deep dive looks at his albums or, his rock and roll musical process. So it really felt like it was due time for a story about someone who had committed to living a life as an artist at a very tricky time in American history and the consequences of that. And that was really my thesis more than anything. And that's what I pitched to Gail, to his widow.
Yeah, well, one of the things that sets your documentary apart from some of the other things that have been done is that you have Gail's cooperation, the cooperation of the family, and access to Frank's extensive vaults. How did you get that permission from Gail and the family trust?
I asked. I honestly did not ask for vault access. I didn't honestly believe the vault existed to the degree that it actually did. I'd heard of it. I'd seen like the fuzzy YouTube videos of Frank walking around down there, but I didn't really think there was much there that would be of value to me, because Frank was so vocal. I should have known better, because I knew Zappa well enough to know that he usually said one thing and meant the opposite. But he was so vocal in his life about not caring about his legacy, not wanting to preserve anything, that I assumed to be masters, recordings, and that would be it. When I pitched Gail my take, which I honestly did not expect her to sign on to, I essentially said I did not want to make a music doc. I did not even really see Zappa as a rock and roll musician. I saw him more as an avant-garde composer who used rock and used doo-wop and used other forms and used humor and ribald, these sort of like ribald lyrics, like the way Spike Jones used instruments, right? Like much more like an Ernie Kovacs or a Spike Jones or even an Albert Ayler, like a full-on classical composer. And she really liked that perspective. And she said that wasn't what she normally got pitched. And she thought it was more in line with the way, not maybe the way Frank viewed himself, but the way that they kind of viewed Zappa, not exactly, but closer. But she said, in order to tell that story, you're going to need the vault. You're going to need the material that we have down there, because the stuff that you need to tell a story does not exist out in the world. But it does exist in our basement. And she didn't really know what they had. She took me down there, and it was like the end of Citizen Kane, floor to ceiling, just every type of media as far as the eye could see. And it was a blessing and a curse moment, because it was like, oh my God, it's like Keys to the Kingdom, but oh my God, there's more stuff here than I'll ever be able to watch, and it needs to be preserved, and who's going to preserve it, and the mind boggled. So it was thus began a very, very mammoth undertaking, which was first to preserve the disintegrating media that was down there that I needed. Film is very sensitive, even old video is very sensitive. So we did a crowdfund campaign, raised a bunch of money, and spent 2 solid years just preserving archive material before even starting to make the doc.
Yeah, the take that you describe, to think of him as a classical composer, or just a composer in general, sometimes he used rock music for it, obviously, is probably the least likely one. I can see why that appealed to her, because I mean, Frank was a lot of different people. I mean, he was, a guitar hero. He was the guy who did like comedy music. He's known for the novelty hit Valley Girl that he did with Moon Unit, and he's known as for being involved with politics, for fighting the Parents Music Resource Center, all those things, and you certainly touch on all of those things in the film. But yours was a different take, so I can see why that appealed to her. Back to the vault for a minute. Describe that. So you actually had like a Kickstarter campaign, and your first job one on this was to go through all that stuff and preserve it. So what was that like? You had to digitize it, or bake the film?
It was unbelievably complicated and expensive. And honestly, at that time, we did not have financing for the documentary. So I had for years, all I was doing was preserving Frank's vault with no guarantee that I was ever going to get to make a film out of any of it. We did the Kickstarter thinking that we would maybe use some of that money for the preservation, some of that money, the movie would have needed way more than the crowdfund, but to at least start the film. But it was clear that it was a very expensive process, and we were very honest with the backers from the get-go how expensive it was going to be. And we basically gave them an ultimatum, like, do you want to use any of this money for the documentary, or do you want it all to go to the preservation? And they were unanimously behind, and rightly, I would say, preserving this media. So what that entailed was, it required, due to the vast range of formats that were down there, and Frank was the opposite of how he presented himself. He was painstakingly interested in preserving his legacy, and painstakingly arduous about the way in which he went about that, meaning he would take 8mm stuff from his childhood, transfer that to 1-inch video, manipulate it, transfer it again to D1, and these are all different video formats, then onto Digibeta. I mean, it was it was a huge undertaking on his part. But the problem was he died in '93, and most of these formats didn't even exist anymore in 2015. So I had to find a proprietary service that was the best in the world at just doing 8 mil, meaning, and it wasn't digitizing, it was actual preservation work, meaning they take the film, they have their own machines that they built that are sprocketless, meaning they're not going to be penetrating that film because it wouldn't survive it. This film was from the 50s, some of it. And you'd get one shot and it would be gone. It would disintegrate. You'd get one chance to capture that on any kind of form. So we had one person who did 8 mil, one person who specialized in 16 no sound, one place that just did 16 sound, one place that just did 1 inch, one place that just did 2 inch video. I mean, it was endless, and they were all extremely expensive because it needed to be museum grade preservation. Then we would take all that media and we would then digitize it and put it onto different forms of archive media. Some forms that we could use for a film in the hopes that we got to make a film. And then the vast quantity of it went on to what's called LTO tape, which is a kind of a museum grade archival digital tape. You can't watch it. It's like all code. But that is preserved forever. That just goes from one version to another ad infinitum, and it'll always be there. All of that's going to end up in a museum somewhere for historical record. We used a fraction of that media for our film, but I was able to watch almost all of it because the preservation process took so long that my editor, Mike Nichols, and I had 2 years to go through this stuff. I then had to go out and find the money for the doc. So it really was it really became a commitment and a labor of love in the truest sense. But it's very gratifying to be on the other end of it.
And basically 5 years across the whole project, right?
Well, more than that, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned
going on 6. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned how he, recorded everything and filmed everything. It's incredible to think that he was that aware of preserving his own legacy, because this was not the day when you could just whip out your iPhone and start recording. I mean, he had to, have people on staff. He had to have, people filming this and recording this. And he recorded, like you say, everything. And we're blessed now that we have all that because we can go back. And of course, his family has released a lot of archival material, a lot of albums, almost as many as he did when he was alive. But it's incredible that he was that aware of the importance of his own work, or he thought that much of his own work that he did that.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I'm not, we'll never know. My suspicion is that it wasn't only that. From the very beginning of his life, Frank liked making stuff, and he liked making visual stuff first. In fact, he started with film when he was very young. Like a lot of us do, who are like, film obsessives. And he had rewinds, and he would edit 8 mil footage, and he would make his own 8 mil movies, and he would also take whatever the family had. He took his mom and dad's wedding film, and he recut it with Godzilla, and he painted all over it and made a new little movie out of it. We use it in the doc. That's all Frank. Frank did that as a teenager. And so Frank liked making stuff. So a lot of the stuff that we have in the vault that he made, that was a record of him, he made it himself. Like we've got video, some of this we didn't use, of him walking around his house with a Betacam, just shooting the house, shooting the family, just making, he used to have like an impromptu quasi-political talk show that he did out of his basement that never aired. He would be sitting in his big easy chair with like other pundits and anchors and political people around him, other friends, and they would talk about politics, like a talk show with like lavaliers on and stuff. And he just did that himself, and it just went up on a shelf. So an aspect of him, just like his music, he just liked making things.
Yeah. Night School, I think that was called. Am I right?
That's correct. Yes, yeah. That is correct.
Yeah. One of the extraordinary things that you do in the film is that you have Frank himself narrating much of it. How in the world were you able to achieve that?
One of the discoveries that we made early on down there was that one thing that Zappa did that was very clever was because he liked engaging with people. So if, let's say you were from K-Rock or a radio station and you called up the house, which you could do in those days, you could literally just call the house and you say, I want to come over for a soundbite on whatever, on the Reagan election or on music, whatever it was. And he would say, come on over. And the K-Rock person would come over and he'd say, the only thing is, if you're going to interview me to get the soundbite, I want a video or film or whatever it was. I want this interview, and then I own it, other than whatever you do with your soundbite. So we found hours and hours and hours of audio and video and film of him talking about stuff with various people who was interviewing that had never been public. And we found all of the night school stuff. And he did other things like that, where he would just sit and shoot the crap with friends about his opinion on things. And we, very painstakingly strung a narrative together out of all of that. We created our own FileMaker database of the visual and audio media. We then keyworded all of it. We did this over several years. So we could literally type in Reagan or sexual revolution, or I don't know, whatever, time signatures if we were dealing with music, and up would pop everything related to that. And we would literally just build these, it's a cheat like crazy, but we built what sounds like narration, but is really a Frankenstein of him on these topics from different periods in time.
Yeah, it's, it really gives the film a great intimacy. Beyond all the home movies and the childhood stuff, it really brings you into the picture from his own narration and from his own storytelling. It's really, nobody else has got that. So kudos to you guys for being able to get that. Anyway, moving on. One of the other aspects about the film is, of course, that you have performance videos in there, and his performances, especially the stuff, I guess, that he did in New York at the Garrick Theater, or just, very early on with the Mothers. It's so unlike anything else. It was unlike anything then. It's pretty much unlike anything now. Maybe the Flaming Lips approach it, I don't know, a little bit. But, what was your reaction to him, like the first time that you became aware of him as a performer or saw some of that footage?
Well, this is a funny thing. And not to get too film nerdy on you or Zappa nerdy on you, but the Garrick Theater was the stuff I was looking for. That's a personal thing. I knew he did it. I was hoping that it existed in some form. There's no record of it anywhere. There's like tiny little milliseconds of it. I asked Gail, she's like, I don't know if it's down there. It was kind of my mini obsession. Like, people ask me, what was your favorite thing you found in the vault? There's amazing stuff across the board. But the thing that I was happiest to find was all that Garrick Theater footage. And the reason is that, I come from a theater background, and I was well aware that Zappa had done this residency at this very small, kind of an off-Broadway theater in the West Village in the 60s called the Garrick, which is now no longer there. And that he had basically had the run of the place all day, every day, day after day after day, week after week for months. And in that kind of incubated period, he found his artistic identity and his performance identity. And he came out from that dark hovel, Zappa, basically, and he went in something else. And to me, that's just, if I was going to make the movie that I want to make above all, that I knew that literally would have an audience of 4, I would have made 2 hours just about the Garrick, because it's an amazing thing. And to your point, the theatrical innovations, I think it had a lot of relationship to the avant-garde theater that was going on at the time in the 60s, even though I grilled Gail on this and she was adamant that Frank wasn't that interested in theater. And yet he did a lot of innovative theatrical things at the Garrick that then got utilized by him. And as you said, became extremely influential to many, many artists, musicians, filmmakers, theater people. all classical musicians, all on down the road, and a lot of that happened at the Garrick. So, that was very profound footage for me to find and kind of wait around. And again, it was splintered across all these different reels. So Mike Nichols and I had to kind of build that and turn it into something coherent. And we would find like a frame here that went like a puzzle into a piece there. But it was very important to me because it really, like you said, like my aim artistically was to really try to convey without judgment who this person was. And the Garrick really helps us do that. It's very intimate and personal, and it's very unique. It's very specific to who Zappa was as an artist. My first experience with Zappa would have been on SNL. As a kid in St. Louis at my friend's house, I remember watching him do Whipping Post on SNL and be on SNL in general. And I remember being very struck by his performance style, that it just wasn't like anything else I ever saw. It didn't really feel like a rock person. In fact, what he did with that song, which was a cover, was he took it and he kind of turned it inside out. He kind of de-rockified it in a way. I found that very compelling. So I was always drawn to him and the uniqueness of his performance style.
Yeah. Well, as a character in a film, he's almost like a filmmaker's dream because he's so iconoclastic. He's such a mass of contradictions. I mean, he seems like the ultimate 60s freak, and yet he was completely anti-drug. He was, in terms of business, I mean, he was one of the first artists who formed their own independent label.
Yeah.
He was political, but he was kind of like a small government Republican almost, and yet, of course, Republicans were his great antagonists from Nixon to the Reagan era to the housewives, the Senate housewives who tried to foist some censorship on music. I mean, certainly it's like he's one of those figures that's so missed today because one can only wonder how he would react to the Trump era. He would actually have something to say. You wouldn't just say his head would explode. He would be fighting it. You got to figure with all his might.
Completely. I mean, he was at the end of the day, a diehard believer in citizens' rights and the importance of voting and the ability to vote and fighting voter suppression and a champion for voter registration and civil rights. And yes, he had some, I mean, for that era, I would say some right-leaning tendencies, but in today's world, he would be a centrist Democrat. I have no doubt about that. I mean, that's basically what that Republican was in the 90s. That's where we've come as a country. But, he was not for obliterating the government. He was not a libertarian in that sense, in the current sense of the word. He was a big believer in the need for social justice and legislation and for certain kinds of for the rights to be upheld for people, basically, is the long and short of it. So sure, he would have been out there fighting. I think, I don't know if he would have been fighting exactly the way I'd have been fighting. He was more conservative than I am, but right now I think we've all been coming together in unison to support voting rights and citizens' rights.
The film kind of begins and ends with some footage from Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic rather, where he was very revered, as he was throughout most of Europe and much of the world. Why do you think he was so much better received overseas than he was in the U.S.?
Because I think that Europe has a longer tradition of intellectual popular artists, and I think that America, especially at that time, didn't really know what to do with an intellectual person who appeared to be a rock and roll performer. I think that it was too much of a gray area, and everything at that time, and to a degree it's still that way in this country, but less so, it was very black and white. And so you could not easily put Zappa in a box, and he did not want you to put him in your box. He did not want to be, Bill Graham always asked him to come up to San Francisco and join their movement. He repeatedly told Graham in very blunt terms to go F himself and the hippies up there, as he would say. But that did not mean he was some table pounding conservative, because he felt just as much animosity towards what he viewed as the pretentious and somewhat fraudulent New York art scene that he felt took itself too seriously. That in America is like a head scratcher, right? So he was hated by everybody from the Grateful Dead to Lou Reed. That's a pretty broad spectrum in music. In Europe, that's easy. It's not a problem. It's a a much more understanding culture in terms of someone who approaches things in that kind of way. So I think they had a much easier time understanding his music. I think that they didn't listen to his ribald lyrics and think that he was juvenile. I think that they heard those and realized he was using them almost like their own instrument. There was an artistic aim that he had with that to this day, I think that Americans don't understand. Less uncommon in Europe. So, you hear it, it's a cliche, right? Like, I had to go to Paris to be revered. I mean, it's, there are many artists, including Hendrix, having to go to London to get a career off the ground. So it's not that uncommon in some ways.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring up another aspect of the film, which is, and I certainly don't want to in this interview imply that it's all archival footage, because of course you shot some of the stuff yourself and interviewed some of his sidemen over the years, Steve Vai, Hornman, Bunk Gardner, Ruth, and Ian Underwood. What was it like talking to them and inserting that footage into the mix?
It was we had to be very judicious. I mean, there was a point at which I didn't want anything that wasn't archival, but there would have been no way to tell that story. And there wasn't enough in the archival that was blunt enough for me. And I felt we really needed that. We needed someone just to call Frank on the carpet for certain behaviors, both good and bad, that he had. That were there, not people pontificating from, in a retrospective fashion. I knew I did not want that. I knew I did not want people, that were movie stars or popular artists, or even people who knew Frank, but that were in the current era and didn't really know him going all the way back to the beginning of his career. That was very important to me, that the only people that I wanted on camera were people that had known Frank, preferably from the early 60s, if not the late 60s, and nobody else. And because I felt that Frank was such a complicated person that it's very easy for people to form opinions about him that are extremely narrow. And I knew that the best chance I had of getting a full spectrum of who he was talking to people who really had been there for all of these permutations and knew that there was all these shades of gray and that it wasn't black and white. And from Gail to Ruth to Steve Vai to Bunk, like the gang that we had, I felt, Scott Tunis, who's sort of one of the newer, Keneally, who are newer artists that had, played with Frank while he was alive. So you're still going back 30 years, if not longer. They still had really interesting opinions, and Tunis had a famously rocky experience working in that band, and so I knew they'd have good things to say, and I was very happy with that. But it was very judicious. I was really going inch by inch on the interviews. Like, do we have enough? Do I need anyone else? Can I stop now? And I would really only get one more person if there was just something we absolutely could not get from the previous. So I kept it as minimal as humanly possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all very informative, and also, I think it's Vai who at some point says something like, we were just tools of the composer. They talk about how he was kind of emotionally unavailable to them. Bunk says at one point, like, I think once he shook my hand and said, "Good job." That just wasn't Frank. They were sort of tools of the composer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think he was known as being kind of a martinet, and I think anyone who even vaguely studies Zappa will get that impression pretty quickly, that he would put bands together, dump them, pick up new stuff. But he was a collagist in a way, and that's the way he made art, as well as the way he conducted his business. And he would use the things that he needed for what he needed them to do. And he was like that with people. And he was like that with his art.
Yeah. And kind of with his family too. If you could briefly share the story of Valley Girl, of Moon, leaving him a note. She just wanted to spend some time with her dad.
No, this is a guy who was on the road all the time, and when he wasn't, he was often tucked away in his studio playing. So that became a way to engage with him. I think was to actually try to find a way to create with him. That the way into his heart was through his art. So that, that was, I think that seemed to be the executed plan. That's the letter that she wrote to him. That's very sweet. And ended up providing him the biggest hit that he ever had, which is ironic.
Yeah. Well, by way of wrapping up, I mean, your film is obviously it's going to be great for fans who, have never seen a lot of this stuff, and want to look back on Frank, because I mean he's been gone so long. It's a great thing to just have something about him out there again, and something new that we haven't heard before or seen before. But also, I think it'll be a great way for people who don't know him to discover who he was and what he was all about. But in terms of music, I mean, do you have any particular period of Frank's music that is your favorite, or you think is a good place to start, or a particular album?
Well, those are two different questions. Because I like, Freak Out, Yellow Shark, right? Or Hot Rats and Yellow Shark are probably my two favorite Zappa albums, which show you how broad my taste in Zappa is, because they're the opposite, right? And I love his classical stuff, and I love his like full on Freak Out stuff. But that's not where you should start. I don't think. I think you should start in the middle with like Apostrophe, Overnight Sensation. I think you should come in an area it's beautiful music, it's great songs, but it's more accessible in a way. And then you should sort of nestle yourself in there. And if you can deal with that stuff, then start spreading yourself in both directions the other way.
Well, and I'm very much like you. I mean, I go all the way back to Freak Out. Apostrophe was probably the first thing I heard when I was in high school. A classmate played it for me because had funny lyrics and all that stuff. But then of course we discovered Hot Rats, which is like so much great. I mean, kind of the start of jazz rock, really, almost. And then Yellow Shark, which is really probably one of my favorite Zappa albums. And just to bring this back to St. Louis, I got to tell you that I was always hoping the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra would play some Zappa music at some point, and it just never happened. And finally, when David Robertson was the music director and conductor here, he organized this thing. He called it the St. Louis Guitar Festival, and it wasn't held in Powell Hall, but it was held at the Pageant and other places, I think. And he got the orchestra together, though, and they played G-Spot Tornado.
Oh, great!
From one of the Synclavier albums.
Yeah.
And but done amazingly on the Yellow Shark. And I got to tell you that when they played it, I actually teared up a little bit.
Yeah.
Which I can't believe that reaction ever happened to anybody while listening to a song called G-Spot Tornado.
Well, we use it.
It's good for me. And
we use it as the emotional kicker in our film too, for probably the same reason. I think once you know Zappa, you know how much was invested in that music at that time. It was his whole life, and it was the end.
Yeah. Well, once again, congratulations on the film. It's really terrific. And is there anything that I did not ask you about? I
don't think so. It's great talking to someone who actually knows about Zappa. So I'll say it makes it go a lot easier.
And I would say the same thing. Yeah. He's an acquired taste, but it's great to have acquired it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I appreciate it. I wish I was down there, and next time.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for doing this, and we hope we see you back in St. Louis sometime soon.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right.